the apocalyptic Jesus makes way more sense than they thought. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I have another Patreon question, and I want to thank Martin Justrell. Forgive me if I butchered your name. And he asks, how could the Jesus Seminar come to the conclusion Jesus did not preach the end of the world when he obviously did? Today's scholarship disagrees, but did they actually have a case? Or is this just a good example on how easily influenced the field can be by unscientific ideas when promoted by prominent people?
Yeah.
Here I am with Dr. Richard Carrier, and we have Santa Claus on the clock ready.
So yeah, no, just very briefly, like my generic answer to that is that they were using a particular set of criteria that led them to particular sets of decisions about what was authentic or not. And I don't know the specific, like what was fashionable at that time that led them to this result. I think the method of criteria doesn't work, and so it leads to false conclusions a lot. So I think they were more driven by their whatever was fashionable, right? The particular thinking at the time. Now, that's all I know. I don't know like the deep history of the Jesus Seminar, what the particular voters were thinking at that particular time as to why they got rid of, why they like voted down the authenticity of the Jesus sayings about the end of the world. So I do know Robert Price is extremely well versed in this. So like he's definitely the expert here.
Two-time PhD, Robert Price, Santa Claus is what we call him, the All-Father, is joining us here on the audio. I have him on the phone, and he's going to give us a little insight because Dr. Price has actually been part of the seminar, leading a member of the seminar.
Right.
Correct here.
Yeah, and thoroughly studying it. So like this is a really complicated historiographical question that's right in his wheelhouse.
Absolutely. So Bob, if you don't mind taking 4 minutes or whatever, describing what led up to it, why would anyone have come to the conclusion granting the guy existed? We have to assume that up front, but without getting into the whole mythicist stuff, what happened? Who made the change, and why did they come down that he didn't expect the world to end and stuff?
Well, I think basically they were influenced in the early days by Burton L. Mack, who in a bunch of books, for instance, A Myth of Innocence, Mark's Gospel, etc., etc. On the one hand, Mack, there's the thought police siren. Mack suggested that this was that the apocalyptic sayings attributed to Jesus weren't authentic because they didn't really fit what we know of the conditions politically in Palestine at the time. That, of course, there was friction, tension, and eventually revolution, but that's a few decades later, and that from what we know from other sources, it wasn't a time of revolution or perceived oppression so much. And if that's the case, what was the point of the historical Jesus? And here the theory comes in, and this is also Burton Mack, though various other New Testament scholars said the same, that Jesus sounds much more like the ancient cynics who were at least in the Decapolis and other places where it would have been available to someone like Jesus. And especially in Galilee of the Gentiles, quote unquote, people like Demonax and Meleager, who were two notable cynics. And their view was there's much in common with other sayings of Jesus and the maxims of various cynics. They preached the government of Zeus, which is pretty much a synonym for the kingdom of God, but by it, they meant one ought to live in accord with nature simply by reason, and that many other topics, like the Buddha said, are not really that don't really tend to edify. But this did mean giving up all your possessions to the poor and renouncing home and family, like Diogenes and others famously did. And of course, like in Luke 14 and other places, Jesus is said to have said, if you don't give up these things, family, etc., you can't be my disciple. And and the mission charge, the don't bring provisions, don't have a change of clothes, etc. This is so similar to what we're told about ancient cynics that it seems to fit better there than with anything else we know. Like there are many parallels between the synoptic teaching of Jesus and the rabbis. For instance, the idea that why are you worried? Doesn't God take care of the animals? You think you're less important to them than they are? You do find that, but you find it in the cynics also, and they take it to mean you don't need all the appurtenances and especially obligations of average mundane life. You're just going to be distracted by worldly cares. You need to get down to business with virtue, and you don't need hardly any material possessions for that. And what you do need, you can beg for. Don't be ashamed. You shouldn't feel shame about anything. And you don't need those entanglements. Seek first this kingdom of God, understood in that sense. But there are various scholars. Crossan has much agreement with this in his books on the historical Jesus.
Right.
And it is a viable. I mean, there are several competing possible theories, and this is one of the plausible ones. So I do know that that's what they had in mind and why they thought the apocalyptic element was an anachronistic later.
But they don't deny that that's there. They don't deny that it's there. They're just saying the primary was likely cynic, right?
Well, yeah, and that Jesus was not preaching the imminent end of the world. They don't agree with Boltzmann, for instance, that he was announcing the soon coming of the final judgment and all of that. But no, that really was an early Christian thing when the shadows of war with Rome were coming, and so various sayings dealing with that. Probably prophecies, so-called, from the risen Jesus, that they weren't any longer making a distinction about between what Jesus said back then and what he must be saying from heaven now.
So let me ask you this one more question, because I know you and I should do an episode actually diving into this in depth. And I have Dr. Carrier here. And my last one is this, because the questioner asks, and you were there historically, you were involved. What shifted the tides? What happened? Did people actually start shifting back toward, we need to root this in Jesus himself, the apocalypticism? You know, Bart Ehrman's famously known for like going at the heart of it, going, you got to have an itinerant apocalyptic guy from the roots. Where is the seminar at, as far as you're aware, in the last decade or two, or, you know?
Well, I'm sure from what I do hear nowadays that they haven't budged on that. Paul Verhoeven was a fellow of the seminar, and he did occasionally report on a Jesus movie he was working on in which Jesus was a revolutionist. And the other fellows kept saying, the rest of us don't really think that's what he was, but he was convinced of it. But they maintained it for the whole time I was there that Jesus was a cynic-like sage. And that's not surprising, since the two founders of the seminar were Robert Funk and John Dominic Crossan, both of whom take the idea of Jesus as a cynic-like, even Zen-like wandering sage. The way they interpret the parables is not like Jeremias and others. They're not apocalyptic. They're language events, kind of like Zen koans, which I thought was a bit anachronistic. But at the cynic thing, no, that does fit the period, and so many of the sayings attributed to Jesus. So I don't know what the deal was, but that is in many ways persuasive and easily plausible reading. So it wasn't like the seminar members just forgot that Jesus is given these sayings. They say no, as I believe Richard said a moment ago, they employed certain criteria that made them think, no, that these are not authentic sayings of Jesus.
Right. Thank you, Santa Claus, Dr. Robert and Price, ladies and gentlemen, the man, the myth, the legend. Thank you for your time and explaining that to us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's anytime. Loads of fun.
I'll call you in a bit.
Okay.
All right, Bob. Bye. All right, you heard it from the guy who was there. He was an eyewitness. He beheld their majesty, okay?
Yeah. I'm actually a fellow of the Western Institute now, which is because the Jesus Seminar was really just a momentary seminar of the Western Institute.
Oh, okay.
So I'm a fellow of the same organization as the Jesus Seminar was.
Well, we needed an eyewitness, you know?
But yeah, oh no, but I came many decades later, right? So like this is the things like I come in by the time I'm joining as a fellow, most of the original Jesus Seminar people are either dead or retired or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So a lot has changed. So like I don't know, like I don't know if there's been a poll recently on this subject, like what, because there's a lot of new blood, a lot of new scholars have come in. So I wonder if it's time to do another Jesus Seminar, frankly.
Yeah.
Because what they did is a Jesus Seminar, then they did the seminar on Acts. They did Acts of Jesus, they did Sayings of Jesus was the Jesus Seminar, and they did Acts of Jesus, and they did the Book of Acts, I think. And then they've switched to doing other things. You can look at the list that they go through. One of the things led to that Gnosticism, getting rid of that's the same people that published the book saying that Gnosticism didn't exist, and it was the whole seminar. It was a unanimous vote on that, by the way. And I've actually voted on some of the issues recently that have happened. When I can get to a seminar,
Right.
I can cast a vote because I'm a fellow. But anyway, so I know like some of the current status quo, but I don't know the exact story of like, because this is in his story, like totally tracks. So like,
Yeah.
my general idea is that what I said is like, it's some sort of fad at the time and their use of the criteria that don't work. And so, like he said, oh yeah, it was Mac. That totally makes sense because he was really big and having a lot of influence then. And the cynic hypothesis is really big then. It's not anymore. But if you think of like all the voters are under the influence of these fads right at that time, and then use the criteria which are malfunctioning, they don't really function very well, you could get that result. And so you get that sort of awkward result. I think that's a good illustration of how unreliable the field is.
Or how science the data is.
Yeah. Also that too. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so I think that's why they did it. And the reason I think the shift has gone back is that there's been a realization, and there's books on this, that they're realizing the criteria don't work. And so there's a lot of like, okay, we got to get rid of this paradigm and do something else. But they do not really come up with anything else to replace it with. And because of that, and then also the changing perspective, since all the critiques of the cynic theory kind of tore that down, is like, it's still plausible, but it can only be part of the story. It can't be the whole story.
Right.
And also the other thing is like there was a shift after that to move more towards studying the Jewishness of Jesus, right? So this was a few decades of that. And that kind of threw down like Bob mentioned, this idea that there was the assumption that there wasn't apocalypticism at that time, like that came decades later. Right. But now we know that's not true, that apocalypticism was fucking rampant from the 1st century BC all the way through.
There be a mix between cynic and...
No, absolutely. And in fact, that's one of the points that I make on the historicity of Jesus. I have, like, look at the cynic hypothesis. Clearly that was I think it clearly was an influence.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's like, I don't think you could just say... Yeah, like Jesus didn't sit at the feet of a cynic philosopher and then go around preaching cynic philosophy. He wasn't a cynic philosopher, right?
Yeah.
But he is definitely being influenced by cynic philosophy for sure. Right?
Yeah, it's in the air.
Yeah. And even
whoever the author is.
Right, and it can be both direct and indirect, right? So I think a lot of that, he mentioned, like, you can find some of this stuff in the rabbinical stuff. I think that could also be coming from cynic influence, right? Cynic influence onto the rabbinate, into the Jewish thinking. Then just the same way that Platonism influenced Philo, and all this stuff is flowing in.
Exactly.
And so like when Jesus is picking up stuff from, let's say, Jewish teachers, like rabbis that he's sitting at the feet of or whatever, they're going to be speaking to him things that are cynic, that ultimately come from the cynic philosophy. And Jesus himself might not even know the pedigree of these ideas, right? He just knows they're coming from these great rabbis or whatever. And they resonate with him, and so yeah, all right, cool.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I absolutely think cynic philosophy is playing a role in here. It just you can't say that he's so thoroughly cynic that he would not be an apocalypticist.
They're trying to make sense of the pericope that sound apocalyptic inside of it.
Yeah, and I think what's happened is by studying the Jewishness thing and studying Messianism more, like the apocalyptic movements, the apocalyptic Jesus makes way more sense than they thought. Like, so now, like, we look at the evidence and go, oh, okay, like they were really like not paying attention as much to this evidence. And so they were downplaying downplaying is the wrong word because it implies they know the truth and are hiding it. It wasn't that. It was that they thought that apocalypticism wasn't as much a thing then. But now we know with accumulated evidence and studies and critique that actually it was. And so that's what's changed. So Jesus now fits in his time better, essentially, as an apocalyptic prophet. There are other things, there are other arguments, like we know apocalypticism started right out of the gate because it's in Paul, right? Paul says Jesus said apocalyptic things. So you would have to say, if you're going to maintain the Jesus seminar position, you would have to say that when Paul says the world's going to end and he's going to come and all this stuff, you would have to then assume that Paul means in a post-mortem revelation, right? It can't have been Jesus before he died, because then that's the opposite of the Jesus seminar position you're saying then. So like, what happened? How did the Christians then suddenly start creating an apocalyptic Jesus within days or years of his death if he himself wasn't an apocalypticist? And there are theories you can build, models you could build where that could happen. But the problem is that those models run into the exact same problems that the Jesus seminar was relying on to come to the conclusion that Jesus wasn't an apocalypticist. So if Paul could be an apocalypticist, or more importantly, Peter can be an apocalypticist, all your arguments for why Jesus wouldn't be go away, because they're like, well, what's the difference between Peter and Jesus, right? They're contemporaries, they're in the same environment, the same causes are operating on them. So yeah, so I think that's why that kind of dissolved over time.
Yeah.
But the root of it, though, is that this attraction to fads, it kind of like argument from prestige, like you have a prestigious scholar, therefore he's right kind of attitude. And then the reliance on these criteria, which everybody is so confident in that now even the field has agreed are garbage, they don't work. They very easily lead you away to the wrong conclusions and things. So anyway, the whole field has agreed with that in a sense, right? Like that's not me saying that. And that's what happened. And so it does show like the methodology of the field is dodgy and has always been dodgy. But this doesn't mean what evangelicals want it to mean, which is that, oh, the Jesus seminar was too skeptical, they were wrong. They should not have voted down so many sayings of Jesus. It's the other way around. Like they were right to be super skeptical of the historicity of a lot of the sayings of Jesus. It's just their method of figuring out which ones are made up and which ones aren't was a bit dodgy and not entirely reliable. So,
Right.
So that you can't take away their work on this point. Like just because their methods were dodgy doesn't mean everything they concluded was wrong, and it doesn't support evangelical literalist takes on the gospel or any of that. So anyway, yeah, I think that's it, and that's why Bob being there and having been through and studied all of that stuff, like he knows what was really going on at that time, and if you didn't have access to that information, I wouldn't have been able to tell you like what exactly specifically was happening in that moment. I could just give you the generic outline of what happened, but that's it. But then you get those specifics. That's the thing. It's a value of history.
That's important. Again, Martin, thank you for being a Patreon supporter, and thank you, Dr. Carrier.